Thank you, Vic. One of the things that's been important in the CLC discussions about how do we move forward with the environmental objectives that we have for lakes has been really coming out of the practical necessity of trying to make change on the landscape that means something in terms of the habitats that's out there. A number of people in the CLC or people in this room are on a variety of review panels reviewing projects for habitat, whether it's Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, whether it's the Fisheries Trust, the Great Lakes Fish and Wildlife Restoration Act, LIFRA with the Army Corps of Engineers. All these great projects for habitat come in, and yet there's no real good context for how we determine which of those have the most value. So that was the context in which Roger and I and Vic and others decided, how can we frame a set of environmental objectives that come from the fisheries agencies, from the lake committees, that then can be used by all these other folks out there, from cities, counties, local angler groups, state agencies themselves, in terms of coming up with where do we put the money behind where our models are? What do we pick for priority areas? So we came up with these environmental objectives, partly to provide a framework for the lake committees and the tech committees to give a framework for where we think there are important places where the needle can be moved, and then to have that information for advice. So that's sort of the context in which we're going through this. So over the past 30 years, we have developed and implemented a lot of cooperative fisheries management throughout the Great Lakes. We haven't been as successful at protecting or improving habitat, particularly those that are sustainable, necessary for fish production. So I'm going to try and offer a perspective about how we how a new set of guideline principles can help us move the needle in a positive way. There are lots of people that live in the Great Lakes Basin with a lot of valuable watersheds and competing uses. The watershed hydrology has changed significantly over time. Water quality issues and contaminants persist. Habitat fragmentation has impacted fish populations. It's a lot of big issues, no easy solutions, and limited options for management agencies. So there has been an elephant in the room in terms of addressing habitat. We can, it's relatively easy to put a slot limit of 16 to 20 harvest slot on walleye, with 20 to 24 no harvest slot, and greater than 24. So we can make up all these fantastic regulations that are going to improve the fish populations, but they're not going to improve the fish populations if there's no habitat there. So we spend a lot of time digging around with things that have relatively little impact compared to the bigger impact that we could be having. We lack a good understanding of how to protect and improve habitat, and it's always compounded by wild cards like AIS and climate change. And even if we know exactly what to do, a lot of times we lack the authority to make those changes, and we don't have the resources to make those effective changes either. The impediments to fish management didn't happen overnight. So there can be conflicting objectives that complicate things. Dam removals may help restore habitat connectivity for spawning locations, but then may be very costly in terms of the AIS species that are allowed to then move up that river system as well, necessitating perhaps scenic control efforts. All those things impact our ability to address fish habitat. So we're pretty good at working together on fish management objectives through the Joint Strategic Plan. We have a lot of years of experience doing that. The fish community objectives have been established. It's the identifying environmental issues that impede fish community objective achievement and working with water quality managers. So part of the way we've been doing that is trying to come up with environmental objectives for the different lakes. Except we have 3 of those done. But they're sitting out there, and we're not completely, we don't feel they're a good tool necessarily to give others who are looking to write habitat projects or spend money to improve habitats. There's not always good guidance in there. So we've been trying to put together some environmental objectives that John alluded to that give us a framework for setting some of those priorities. But the deal is that this is going to involve work, additional work on behalf of the lake committees and the tech committees to define some of those functional habitats. So our premise is that sustainable fisheries can occur if functional habitats are protected or improved through a systematic, adaptive, cumulative, collaborative approach. All those good words for the sorts of things we do. And that also accommodates fisheries value. There has to be a fisheries value in terms of the habitat work that we are trying to improve, because our goal is to improve the fisheries that are out there. And then we can act on the manageable anthropogenic stresses that are causing the strains on the system. So we spent a lot of work talking about functional habitats and how we might define them. So this is our best attempt. Functional habitats are dynamic systems of hydraulically connected areas that support the requirements of desired fish species for sustainable production, whether that's spawning, egg survival, larval growth, juvenile growth, adult survival, going back through spawn. All, habitat is used by fish during all aspects of the life history. And fish, unlike a lot of, unlike the situation deer managers are facing with, every little life stage of fish has a completely different environment that is subjected to over orders of magnitude of growth. One of the things, to take sort of an example of some functional habitats, there's parts of river systems that are very important, reef complexes, coastal wetlands. It's maybe where several of those functional habitats really come together that may be the most important priority managements for us to look at as we develop these priority management areas within a lake that we want to have special effort put toward. And we can define key habitat management areas in the Great Lakes. And it's pretty easy to draw a map where you see a lot of the shallow areas or the reef complexes, harbors, bays. We have a pretty good feeling for where a lot of the key fish habitat areas are in the lake, whether we can completely define where those are. But these are examples from the fish community objectives and environmental objectives across all the lakes. So you see Saginaw Bay, Green Bay being particular examples, and mid-lake reefs. So what can we do? There's sort of general types of actions. Once we can guard against impairments, so protection is important. Restoration is important, and enhancements are important. While there may be a balance between all those three, our group thought that we really could prioritize them as being protection as the highest priority, restoration as second priority, and enhancement third priority if we were to try to prioritize those types of actions within a particular lake, or taking a look at where we thought the most effort should be put, where we get the most bang for the buck. Sometimes we feel it really is in protection, so that you don't have to then go down the road of improvement or restoration later on. Protecting is always, I think, the highest priority that we should be trying to shoot for. So protection, prevent AIS establishment, prohibit pollution, conservation of watersheds. Restoration is barrier removal, removal of contaminants, eradicating aquatic invasive species. Enhancements might be partial reconnections, adding structure to a system where structure is lacking. one of the, it's interesting going to Google Earth and exploring the coastal shorelines of the Great Lakes. One of the things I did when I became the Lake Erie Basin Coordinator for Lake Michigan is I went to Google Earth and I just followed the shoreline from Lake Huron down to Lake Erie through the Huron-Erie corridor, and I counted the number of trees on the western shore that overlapped the water or had actually fallen into the water. And from that entire corridor, from Lake Huron to the mouth in Lake Erie, on the US side, I found one tree. It gives you an idea of the scale of habitat loss that we've exhibited in some of our connecting waters, which are, I think, sometimes get short shrift by us concentrating on lakes. The connecting waters are where a lot of the fisheries are, the high fisheries values, and where a lot of the habitat has been lost, and where some of our key enhancements and restorations probably need to occur. So, for example, if we take an example from Lake Erie, there's a Ballville Dam on the Sandusky River, which is about 20 miles from where I grew up in Tiffin, Ohio. The Sandusky River flows up to Sandusky Bay. The Ballville Dam has been a big impediment for walleye and other species moving in that. A hypothesis is that if we move the dam, then recruitment of the walleye stock will increase. We'll have walleye spawning in areas above. We'll have substrate quality improvements in the current spawning areas, and larval production will increase. So here is an example, is a set of a hypothesis and some expected outcomes that we could predict from the habitat improvements. We really think that it's important to have hypotheses and hypothesis testing as we're moving forward with habitat protection and changes, because that allows us to get a measure of whether we're having an impact on the system. Are we moving the needle? Do we have an impact? You need to know beforehand what you're expecting to see. You need to have a way of following up and evaluating that. Fisheries are valuable sources of food, economic outputs, migratory stocks benefit across jurisdictions. There's a lot of social satisfaction, so fisheries are valuable to the Great Lakes. And we have good values, something known for some of the fisheries at regional jurisdictional scales, but not really for functional habitat scales. So that's an issue, is how much economic gain can we get from particular types of habitat improvement. There are scales of influence. The environmental principles are met Great Lakes basin-wide. We have the individual lakes, then we have the functional habitats and within that. So as we scale down from the environmental principles that we produced in the document that the CLC has recently accepted, we do have lake-specific objectives and evaluations which need to come from the lake committees and the tech committees. And then there's the regulations, policies, practices, and projects at the very lowest level. So the environmental principles and the objectives set the priorities, and then the decisions that are made include what we refer to as applicators, which are the people that may be applying for grants or actually doing work on the landscape. Those aren't often our agencies, though they could be. There are a whole variety of folks out there that are interested in doing what they can to improve habitat for fish and for other aquatic species. So it's how we communicate with the applicators about what we feel are the most important issues out there that, so we can try to direct their efforts in ways that make the biggest difference to them and to us and to the fisheries. So how are the environmental principles potentially used by applicators? They inform decisions by whether they're coastal zone managers, local governments, watershed managers, in terms of regulatory permits, recommended use of best management practices, funding assistance, planning, communications with the public, facilitate resource acquisition, whether that's easements or outright purchases of key habitats, And the informed project selection for funding, which is where we began this whole effort in trying to evaluate how we could best add to the process of the reviews for Great Lakes Fishery and Wildlife Restoration Act, GLIFR, EPA projects, NOAA, Great Lakes Basin and Fish Habitat Action Plan. There are all these efforts that are spending a lot of money at the moment, especially with GLR money out there available, that are just looking for how we spend the money and get the most bang for the buck. Without a framework for where we think the most important areas are and what priorities there are for those, I think that we could be wasting a lot of money on projects that don't really mean that much to the fisheries. And certainly in the GLIFR program, we've seen enough of those projects that it's a very good sounding project, but it costs a lot of money to have the Corps do something. And what are the long-term benefits? We don't see very many for some of those. So we need to do a better job of getting the information out there to people that want to do something about what they can do and where they would have the biggest impact. So there's no easy, quick way to improve or protect fish habitat. The Joint Strategic Plan guides us to develop fish community objectives, identify impediments, ask us to work with water quality managers. We've done that, but we need to do more. The environmental principles offer a framework to help us identify key priority areas to focus short-term efforts of applicators in each lake's watershed and basin. But we need to do that quickly in order to make those key priority areas available for people that are doing projects and wanting to do projects now in the short term. We need outcomes, not more documents to sit on the shelf. We need to strengthen the working relationship between fish managers and key applicators. And we need to do more of that interacting and collaboration with people other than ourselves that do have the ability to impact habitat that improves fisheries value. And that means working with EPA and other state agencies within our own states that have that ability, and working with Nature Conservancy and other groups out there of interested publics that want to make a difference, make a change. So I think that's where the key challenges are for us. And in the short term, we want to challenge the lake committees to really take a look and try to develop a list of key priority areas where they would like to provide advice for people out there looking for funding on what they could do to move the needle. So that's a quick perspective on why we've been trying to develop these principles and how we might be able to use them. But it's going to require commitment and work on our part to make a difference.